So in my view, I think he's causing a constitutional crisis intentionally so that this goes to the Supreme Court.
Some legal experts say our country could be headed toward a constitutional crisis as the president pushes the boundaries of his powers.
Certainly, we are seeing a lot of critics of this White House suggest that they are on the cusp of a constitutional crisis.
Mark, other administrations have clashed with courts before. So how do you see it? Is this a constitutional crisis, or is it just heightened friction between these two branches?
If you've been following the news lately, you've probably heard someone utter the phrase constitutional crisis quite a bit.
The New York Times published a report earlier this week where legal scholars sounded the alarm on Trump's actions. In that report, which was titled "Trump's Actions Have Created a Constitutional Crisis," scholars say, University of California, Berkeley's Dean Erwin Chemerinsky told the Times, "We are in the midst of a constitutional crisis right now. There have been so many unconstitutional and illegal actions in the first 18 days of the Trump presidency," he added. "We never have seen anything like this." Chemerinsky told the Times that revoking birthright citizenship, freezing federal spending, firing agency heads, shutting down agencies, and firing certain government employees all constitute lawless conduct. Rhode Island federal judge John McConnell issued a ruling Monday saying that the Trump administration had ignored his order to unfreeze federal funding. He said, quote, "The states have presented evidence in this motion that the defendants in some cases have continued to improperly freeze federal funding and refused to resume disbursement of appropriated federal funds. The broad, categorical and sweeping freeze of federal funds is, as the court found, likely unconstitutional and has caused and continues to cause irreparable harm."
FCC records show McConnell had donated hundreds of thousands to Democratic PACs and campaigns when he was a private practice attorney. His last donation, however, was in March 2009. Now, White House spokesperson Harrison Fields said of the ruling, each executive order will hold up in court because every action of the Trump-Vance administration is completely lawful. Any legal challenge against it is nothing more than an attempt to undermine the will of the American people.
Trump did say yesterday that he would abide by any court rulings.
And here's MSNBC legal analyst Danny Cevallos yesterday writing a warning, against prematurely using the words constitutional crisis.
I think we need to be careful with the term constitutional crisis because as I define it, that would be a situation where the Constitution doesn't have an answer and there is a pressing conflict. The flurry of executive orders, the chaos, that I think doesn't get us to crisis yet. It is irritating for the courts. It is challenging. It could lead to a serious problem if, as you said, they become too congested with dealing with these orders.
They keep coming. Yeah.
The crisis occurs, and we've already talked about it, at the moment when there is a court order and the president or the administration refuses to follow it. Because historically, we don't really have a clear answer for what to do in that situation.
Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor spoke with Knight Foundation CEO Maribel Perez Wadsworth yesterday, where she made some telling remarks. Here she is.
The woman who asked Franklin, she said, "Do we have a monarchy or something else?" And his response was a republic. Our founders were hell-bent on ensuring that we didn't have a monarchy. And the first way they thought of that was to give Congress the power of the purse.
Now, Vice President J.D. Vance has jumped into this conversation, writing on X, quote, "If a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the Attorney General in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that would also be illegal. Judges are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate power." The right-leaning Article 3 Project founder Mike Davis wrote, in part, "The President of the United States has all federal executive power under Article 2 of the Constitution. Courts can stop him if he tries to steal power from other branches like Biden did with student loan forgiveness, but activist judges stopping the president from exercising executive power, like auditing Treasury payments or recalling Foreign Service officers, is a radical, dangerous, and unacceptable assault on the Constitution."
Lincoln Project founder Rick Wilson wrote on Blue Sky, "If you're wondering if you're in a constitutional crisis and that the Republic could collapse at any moment, you are."
Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro wrote on X, "Democrats, your messaging didn't work when it was threat to democracy. Branding it constitutional crisis ain't gonna cut it." Constitutional crisis, Niall.
I think we might disagree on this one, Robby, but go ahead.
Might. But you must, surely you would concede that we have not gotten to the point where you're having high-level court decisions being made, for instance, by the Supreme Court, and having Trump say, as Andrew Jackson once did, the court made their decision, now let them enforce it. That was a constitutional crisis. We certainly have not gotten to that point, have we?
Well, we have gotten to the point where certainly at least one judge believes that the administration has ignored a lawful order regarding the freeze on the disbursement of federal funds, and that's why that judge said what he said and said that they had ignored this. To the point that we were discussing in the introduction about what J.D. Vance said, firstly, I think that does lay the ground for some kind of constitutional crisis, but also if, he should maybe seek a refund from Yale Law School or something, to suggest that it is unlawful for the courts to rule on a military operation. I mean, people who are American soldiers are still subject to law, and of course the criminal justice system can still act against them if they are acting outside of the law. Vance then went on to say this thing about that it is not for the courts. Courts are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Well, if it's legitimate, obviously not. But the courts rule all the time on what is a legitimate or illegitimate use of executive power. And I think even you would acknowledge that it's very important that they do so.
Yes, in fact, I would like if the court would put more sharp limits on the executive powers and that Congress would actually do its job. And it is important, while Republicans control both houses of Congress, to do some lawmaking, do some legislating to back up the agenda that Trump and Musk are implementing. I've quoted Rand Paul quite a bit lately. He's saying a lot of things I agree with, as it happens to be the case. He tweeted yesterday or the day before that, like, look, this is all good. I'm happy about it, but we have to do rescission. These funds have been appropriated. You can't unwind that unless you send it back to Congress and Congress takes a vote to say, okay, yeah, we allocated this funding, but we don't actually want the executive to spend it anymore because we've decided it's pointless to do so. That happens prior. We can use that to cancel out some of that spending, but we actually have to do that because this spending already has been appropriated. I think of all the powers the federal government has, or the executive branch has, it makes sense that the executive has pretty broad discretion to to get rid of employees in the executive branch in these various agencies. Maybe if some of it is being done unlawfully, obviously that's going to work its way through the courts. And I, of course, think the Trump administration should have to listen to the courts. Look, I don't like the fact that the executive branch has gained so much power relative to the other two branches of government over the previous, 50 years or even more, going back to, I'm recalling FDR, who had that's probably the only thing like this we've ever seen, who had a dramatic number of laws and actions taken in his first 100 days to respond to the Great Depression. I was against a lot of that because that's, progressive governance. Now you're having the conservative or libertarian version of that, but it's important to do it through Congress, of course. But, Congress has, for instance, on foreign policy, Congress has given up its power over foreign policy to the executive branch slowly and then quickly, swiftly over the last however many years. I wish that had never happened, but it did happen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, yes, I do know what you mean. But the point here, I think, is that in these cases like the federal freeze, the underlying argument, which is a valid argument to have one way or another, has not been decided. And a judge in this instance has said, you can't continue to the Trump administration, you can't continue to do this while we decide the underlying case. And it appears to be the fact that the Trump administration has said, well, screw you, we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. That obviously is, I think, lawless and very dangerous and an incursion onto the independence of the judiciary. And one more thing, Robby, because it gets to the point that you raised at the start. So a shout out to a reporter at Politico here, Ian Ward, who talks about
government-funded Politico.
At least you stood up against that.
I did indeed disagree with MAGA people on that one.
So Ward talks about the fact that he did a profile in January 2023 of J.D. Vance, and he interviewed Vance. And during the interview, he referred to comments that Vance had made on a conservative podcast in 2021, which suggested, Vance suggested that is, that if Trump was re-elected, he should, quote, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat and every civil servant in the administrative state, and when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. And Ward writes, I asked Vance if this was still his view. Yup, he responded. So you do have a sitting Vice President of the United States espousing exactly the kind of view that you acknowledge is a constitutional crisis.
Yes, and I would remind J.D. Vance that there is, maybe he just enjoys the fight of it, but there's no reason to let it get to that because the Republicans have control of Congress. We can just pass a law to fire some of those, or to restructure the federal bureaucracy and eliminate DEI or mid-level bureaucracy or whatever you want to do. You can do that. You control Congress. If the Democrats try to stand in your way, then you can go before the American people and say, we are trying to reduce the size of government for the first time ever, and here are all the Democrats who are blocking us. But they haven't, at least they haven't even let it get to that because they're doing it via executive order. So, like you, I would like to do it lawfully, of course,
We would
so
like
that
to
there's no
uphold
crisis.
We're pro the rule of law here.
Up next, the battle for ChatGPT and the soul of AI. It's a battle between two people, Sam Altman and Elon Musk. We'll talk about it.